In this video, we're going to talk about how to determine whether a relation is a function. A function is a relation in which each input, or x value, corresponds to a unique output, or y value. The important idea here is that your x value does not repeat. So that's how we're going to figure out if a relation is a function. We're going to look for the repeated x. So remember, relations can be described different ways. So we're going to be looking at relations described in all of these different formats and try to figure out whether those relations represent functions. So is this relation a function? State the domain and range. So to figure out whether a relation is a function, you need to look for the repeated x. So remember that in a mapping diagram, every arrow represents an ordered pair. So to figure out if there's any repeated x value, you're going to look if any of these x's have more than one arrow coming from it. And so in this case, it does not. We have no repeated x, so yes, this is a function. So now to list out the domain, we're going to list out all of the x values. So the members in the domain are going to be 3, 0, -3, -6. The range is going to be all of the y values. So those values are -1, 0, and 2. So is this relation a function, and then state the domain and range. So once again, we're going to study the x values to figure out whether this relation is a function. Well, notice here that I have this 2 that's repeated several times. So that automatically means that no, this is not a function. Now we're going to list out the x values to describe the domain. So remember, we don't need to write a repeated value more than once, so we're just going to write 2, 4, and 5. The range will be all of the y values, so the range will be -9, -7, -3, 1, and 8. So is this relation a function, and state the domain and range. So remember that in a set of ordered pairs, each ordered pair represents an x and y value. So we're going to first study the x values and see if there's any repeats. So notice that there are no repeats, so yes, this is a function. So for the domain, we're going to list out all of those x values. So those x values are -8, -4, -3, 0, 3, and 4. The range is all of the y values, so we're going to list out all of the second numbers in each of these ordered pairs. So the range will be 4, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. So when we are looking at a graph, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to use something called the vertical line test to determine whether a relation is a function. So what we do when we do the vertical line test is we draw vertical lines through our graph. And then we say that if any vertical line passes through a graph more than once, then it is not a function. And really, this is another way of saying look for the repeated x. Let me show you what that means. So look in this example. This is not a function because you see here there's a vertical line. It passes through the graph more than once. You can see here it passes through 2 points. So it's not a function. And the reason is because notice that these 2 points will actually have the same x value, right? If we were to write the xy coordinates, the x coordinates would be the same, but we would have different y values. So really, this is a way of saying look for the repeated x. So that's how the vertical line test can be used to figure out whether a graph is a function. Notice in this graph we have a function, because if I draw vertical lines, it doesn't matter how many I draw, they'll only pass through the graph once. Okay, so if a vertical line passes through a graph more than once, then it is not a function. If you can only draw lines that pass through once, then it is a function. So let's use the vertical line test to determine whether these relations are functions. So when you have graphs that are on a grid, you can use the grid as your vertical lines. Or you can choose to draw them in yourself. So here on this function, as soon as I start drawing vertical lines, they're going to pass through more than once. And you only need to have this to happen once. So as long as it happens at least once, it is not a function. Now let's look at this graph. It doesn't matter how many vertical lines I draw, they're all only going to pass through once. So that means that yes, it is a function. Now in this graph, I have a circle. So notice that the minute I start drawing vertical lines, it's going to pass through more than once. So that means that no, it is not a function. So what if we just have a bunch of points? Can we still determine whether it's a function? You can still use the vertical line test. So you just start drawing vertical lines through these points, and you want to check if any line will pass through more than once. Well, I was okay until I got to this point where I do have a vertical line that passes through 2 points. So no, this is not a function. So what if you're given an equation? So if you're given an equation, you can actually just create a graph. So using either your TI calculator or Desmos, whichever you choose, you can create a graph of y equals x squared plus 2. If you're using the TI calculator, you'll go to y equals, enter in this equation, and then push the graph button to see the graph. Now it doesn't have grids on it, but you'll have to use your pen or your finger to kind of estimate where the vertical lines will be and kind of figure out if they'll pass through the graph more than once. In Desmos, you can actually type this into the boxes where you can enter the equation, and you'll be able to see with the grids on the graph whether this relation is a function. So here I've taken a screenshot of a graph of this in Desmos, and you can see here that this relation is a function. It doesn't matter if I use the grid lines or if I draw in my own vertical lines, they're only going to pass through this graph once. So yes, this is a function. So in summary, remember that a relation is a function if every input, or x value, has a unique output. In other words, no x values are repeated for different values of y. From a graph, you can check whether a relation is a function using the vertical line test.